Being a freelance artist or graphic designer is awesome, but when it comes to getting paid, things can get a little tricky because in our industry, it's commonplace for clients to sometimes try to not pay you for your work, or pay you after you do the work, or offer you some other compensation that's not actually money. I'm digital artist Aaron Rutten, and in this video, I'm going to share some tips from my own personal experience as a freelance artist and graphic designer that'll help you always get paid for the work that you do. So these are lessons from the school of hard knocks. I've been through it, and I'm going to share all of my advice with you so you don't have to go through all of these hard knocks without at least a little bit of guidance. So first, let's start with a very common mistake for artists and designers, and that is not charging enough for the work that you do. It's really easy to price yourself low so that you're competitive and you get work over the guy who charges twice as much as you, and there's all these reasonings for why you should do it, but in the end, you should charge whatever you feel like you're worth, and don't let your ego get to you and decide, well, I'm worth $500 an hour if you don't have a portfolio to back that up. You want to price yourself competitively, but don't price yourself so low that you end up doing a lot of work and you really stress yourself out and you make it really difficult to make a living because you're taking on too many projects and not getting paid enough for each of them. You have to value yourself and your time for clients to be able to value you as well. And you should always listen to clients when they say that you should charge more. People have told me that personally, not just one person, a few different people. And eventually I went, actually, maybe I should charge more. And I did, and they paid me more. And anytime that I've wanted to increase my rates or get more for a project, I don't have a problem asking for more money, because if I feel like that's what it's going to take for me to be able to do the project, then that's what it's going to take. And people are happy to pay you for that because you value yourself, they will value you, and they'll see that. If you start underpricing yourself, people are going to see that in you, and they're going to go, oh, this is a cheap designer. And you're always going to attract cheapskates. You don't want to attract cheapskates. You want to attract people who value your time and other people's time as well, because they want their time valued. The next mistake kind of goes hand in hand with not charging enough or charging too much, and that is overbidding or underbidding a particular job. And you probably want to err more on the side of overbidding the job rather than underbidding, because if you underbid the job, what's going to happen is you're going to have a whole bunch of work to do and the project's not going to be finished, and the client's going to say, well, you need to do this and this and this. It's still not done. I'm not going to pay you until you're finished. And you'll just have to keep working on it and working on it and working on it until it's done without getting any additional compensation, which is known as eating it. So you definitely do not want to underbid jobs. That is a stupid idea for you. Sure, it might make the client go, oh, okay, I'll jump on this because it's really cheap. But if you can't actually do it for that much, or if you're completely wrong about how long you thought it would take to finish the job, that just sucks all around. So don't get into that position. Now, overbidding is not necessarily good from a client's perspective because the client ends up thinking that they have to pay more. But that doesn't mean that you have to charge them more. You could just give yourself a little bit of headroom and say, okay, realistically, this is probably going to take $100 to complete this project, but there might be some extra revisions and there could be some other things that are unforeseen. So let's say it'll be $100 to $200. And the client knows that, okay, worst case scenario, I'm paying around $200, but it could be less than that. And most people understand that. So I always overbid projects, but I don't frame it in the way that's saying, oh, I'm just going to charge you more. I frame it in a way that says, here's realistically what the project might be, and here's what it could be if it goes a little bit longer. And when you frame it in that context and you say, well, if there's a lot of revisions, it could take longer, the client's going to go, gee, maybe I shouldn't have you change things 5 or 10 or 20 times that don't really matter. I'll be more clear about what I want you to do, and I'll be a lot less picky because I don't want to pay a whole bunch. The next scenario that you definitely do not want to be in is not getting a deposit for the project and then the client never pays you for the work that you completed. If there's anything in this video that I want you to remember, it is always get a deposit. Always get a deposit. Always get a deposit. Always get a deposit. Unless it's like a friend or a family member or a trusted client who you've worked with a whole bunch in the past and you know they're going to pay you, always get a deposit. Because even if you complete the project or do part of the work on the project and you never hear from the client again, at least you got paid something for the work that you did. Now you want to make sure that your deposit's going to cover the initial time that you put into the project. So if you're going to do half of the project, make sure you get paid for half of the project. If you're just going to do something like maybe an initial sketch, then you can make sure that your deposit just covers the sketch. Now, it isn't unheard of to ask to get paid up front. You could say, I want to be paid in full before I start on this project. You're doing work, you're taking the risk, and if the client's already seen your portfolio, they see that you have references, they know what you're capable of, there shouldn't be any problem with them paying you at least a deposit, if not paying you in full before you start on the project. Now, I already talked about revisions a little bit, but I want to go back to that and just put some more emphasis on it, because you want to make sure that you always allow time for revisions. There's almost always going to be revisions. Clients will tell you all the time, oh, I want it exactly like this. There aren't going to be any revisions. I want exactly a red circle, nothing else. And then guess what? You send them a red circle and they want a yellow triangle. Now, sometimes the revisions are their fault and sometimes they're your fault. But revisions are part of the design process, and you have to expect that you're not going to get the design right the very first time. So if you think your project's going to take 1 hour to complete, tell the client that it's going to take an hour and a half or 2 hours to complete if there's a lot of revisions. So again, they know that they could pay this much or they could pay this much, depending on how much work goes into the project. You have to explain everything to the client in a way that they can understand. And if you just say it just like I told you, and you say, look, every project takes at least some revisions to get it perfect. We want to make sure that it's exactly the way you want it. So if you need me to change something here or there, I'm happy to do that. But just realize if we end up making a lot of revisions, then I'm putting in more work. And of course, the project is going to cost more. That makes sense, right? Now there's revisions and then there's revisions. There's excessive revisions. There's revisions that never, ever end. And I have experienced projects like this where they just keep going and going and going and going and going and they never end. Those kind of projects are not very common, and I think for the most part, you want to try to avoid situations like that, because I know the money's good and you're going to get regular work, but at some point you're going to get sick of working on that project and you're just going to want it to end, and projects just shouldn't go on forever. That's the point of somebody hiring you, is to help them complete the project, not just keep the wheels spinning forever. So you have to kind of take the reins a little bit and go, okay, here's what I'm willing to do. I want to see an end to this project, and whatever the client's stuck on, help them work through that so the project can come to an end. And if people have an endless amount of money to put into a project, then there really is no incentive to finish the project. Now, on the other hand, you might be working under an estimate and you might have told the client, hey, this is going to be 2 hours of my time. I'm going to charge you this much to complete the project. And if the client just keeps asking for revision after revision after revision, eventually you're not making that much per hour because you're exceeding the number of hours that you said you were going to put into the project and exceeding the amount of compensation that you agreed to. So if that's the case, you need to let them know, look, this is what we agreed on originally. You said you wanted me to make this, but now you're saying that you want to see 3 other examples that are completely different. This is adding work to the project, and so I would like to be compensated more since I'm doing more work. It's not unfair for you to ask that, and anybody who's respectful of your time is going to be fine with that. Or they're going to go, wow, I'm being way too picky about this project. I'm going to try to kind of rein it in a little bit and not give you so many revisions so we can get this thing done. If the client is changing the terms of the project by adding more work that's outside of the scope of what you agreed to, they're changing the terms of the agreement. So it's perfectly fair for you to change your terms of the agreement because it's a contract. And so if something changes on their end, then you should make the adjustment on your end to make sure that you're always being treated fairly and always getting fairly compensated for your time. And there are just some projects that require excessive revisions. There's no getting around it. So again, just make sure that you're adding a little bit of headroom and say, okay, this might take 2 hours or it might take 6 hours, and the client will understand. Let's move on to another scenario which you really don't want to be in, but you kind of have to be in sometimes, because if you do work for big corporations who have a payroll system and it has to go through this person and that person and there's a chain of command and all this stuff, then you can end up with clients who take a long time to pay the final invoice. And so you've done the work, a month or 2 goes by and you still haven't been paid, but you know you're going to get paid, but it's just kind of annoying that you have to wait. Aside from sending a friendly reminder now and then, there's really not much you can do here. Unfortunately, that's just how it goes. So don't always expect that you're going to get paid immediately. You want to give some slack to bigger corporations and people who deal with payroll, but individuals, people who can just log on to PayPal and send you money like that, or meet up with you and cut you a check, they should be able to pay you promptly if you've completed the work. Now, if you have a regular client who you like, who you've worked for in the past, and they always end up paying you, but they pay you late, you can let them know for the next project, I am charging a 25% late fee on any invoices that aren't paid after 30 days. Then that lights a fire under their butt and they know that they need to pay you by this date, otherwise they're going to have to pay more for the project. Again, that's not unreasonable. If you don't pay your phone bill or your utility bill, then you usually have late fees. If you don't pay your rent, then you have a late fee. So it's not uncommon for something like that to exist in an agreement because it's necessary to protect the person who's done the work or provided the service. Now, while we're on the topic of clients who take a long time to do things, there's also clients who take a long time to give you feedback. And so maybe you got a deposit for the work and maybe you did your end of the bargain where you produced half of the project, but you have to get some input from them. Let's say, you ask them, do you like this logo concept? And they take a week or a month to respond to you. Well, that's all time that you have to wait. You put in the work, you put in the hours, and hopefully you got a deposit so you're covered for your time, but you want to finish the project so you can take on other projects. You definitely want to be on people and make sure that you stay in constant contact to keep things moving along. Sometimes you have to be the one to grease the wheels, but just be fair and realize that everyone's on their own time scale, and some people answer emails immediately, some people answer in a couple of days, some people answer in a month. And in all fairness, for me personally, I don't always respond to emails the very same day. Sometimes I have things going on and I have to kind of adjust my priorities and add things to the queue, and I can't get to certain emails until a little bit later than I probably should. And so if you're kind of playing this ping pong game between your client who takes a long time to respond and you take a long time to respond, then a project that should only take a week to complete can take 2 months to complete. So it's not only on them to be more responsive via email, it's also on you to keep the communication fluid and fast. And this is why deadlines are important for you and for the client, because you can say, okay, this project needs to be done by the end of the month. And then you can both agree, okay, we need to make sure that this is done. Maybe we add a little bit of room for flexibility, maybe it can be a few days or a week or so, but this is when we're going to aim to complete the project. Now, if you're in a situation where you've got a deposit, but maybe your client can't finish the project yet, maybe they go on vacation or maybe something happens and they need you to just sit tight for a few months, that's probably not a big deal if you received a deposit that's already compensated you for the time that you've put in, if not a little bit more. But if you've done more work than your deposit covers, make sure that they send you some money just to cover that time that you spent, to make sure that you're completely square. Then they can go on vacation, do their thing, come back in a couple of months, and you can resume the project. Everyone's happy because you've been paid for all the time you put in, and they're happy knowing that you're willing to finish the project when they come back. So we've talked about some tricky scenarios, but we haven't talked about too many horrible, nasty, terrible scenarios that you never, ever want to be in. So let's go ahead and talk about one. In this scenario, you took on a project, you put in several hours of work, you produced a completed design, you sent it off to the client, and the client never emails you back, never responds, won't take your phone calls, won't return any kind of contact that you send them. This person is a scumbag. And unfortunately, there's a lot of scumbags out there like that. There's a lot of people who want to take advantage of the fact that they can ask somebody to do something for free without giving them a deposit or without compensating them in any way, and then either take their design or just decide, I don't like it, but I'm still not going to pay you. And usually not paying coincides with being a cheapskate, so definitely keep an eye out for people like that. People who want to nickel and dime you are probably also people who are not going to pay you for the project. So just stay as far away as possible from anybody who gives you a weird vibe in your initial correspondence with them. So remember how I talked about how you should always get a deposit? Well, guess what? If you always get a deposit, you don't have to worry about this scenario because you got a deposit. Always get a deposit. And if the client doesn't want to pay you a deposit, don't take the job. Tell them good luck. Because again, even if that client has you send them some work, they gave you a deposit and then you never hear from them again, at least you got paid for the time that you put into the project. And in addition to getting a deposit, make sure that you're not sending any completed files or high-res files or anything that the client can just take before paying you the final amount. Make sure that if you send them an image, it's a low-res image and it has a watermark on it. Because if you think about it, you got your deposit, and then let's say you produce the design, you're going to expect them to pay the other half of the deposit. But if you've already sent them the design, they have no reason to send you the other half of the payment. They have the design, and so they can just poof, disappear. This has all happened to me. It hasn't happened once, it's happened multiple times. And so that's why I always get a deposit. That's why I never send the high-res deliverables. I send watermarked copies unless it's someone I trust. Now, I really hope that this doesn't happen to you, but if it does, and a client takes your design and doesn't pay you for it or doesn't pay you in full, don't let them get away with it. If you see that they're using it online, call them out, go on their website, contact them and say, hey, look, you totally have my design up. You never paid me for this project. Take it down. This is my image. I own this until I've given you the right to use it because you paid me. And that's how copyright law works. You as the creator own the rights to the image and you decide how the client can use the rights. And believe it or not, I have experienced this more than once. I created a logo design for a client and they never paid me for the project. And they had the logo design up on their website. So what I did is I'd send him a PayPal invoice and just make sure to hit reminder on it every few weeks or so. I'd send him email reminders and just let him know, look, you have the logo up. You need to pay me for my time. And I just kept bugging him and bugging him and bugging him And I wasn't being rude. I was simply just asking to be paid for the work I did and reminding him. And eventually he got annoyed and he took it down. Now, if this project involved a lot of money, then you probably want to seek the advice of a lawyer. They'll be able to help you better than I will with my advice in this video. But you do have legal options you can pursue to get paid for your time. You do have to weigh out whether or not paying that lawyer and taking the time to go to court and what you would get for the project is even worth all of that time. It's better just not to get in that scenario to begin with. Okay, so here's another scenario that you don't want to be in. The client gave you a deposit, but they're not satisfied with the work that you sent them, and they want their deposit refunded. Now, this could be a couple of things. One is that you completely suck and your work sucks and you shouldn't be paid for your time, but that's probably not the case. The other is usually due to the client not being specific enough about what they want. You know, if they say, I want a drawing of a dump truck, and you go, okay, I'll draw a dump truck. Gee, which angle do you want it drawn from? Which color do you want it? And the client goes, I don't care, just draw me a dump truck. You draw a dump truck. And then they go, nope, that's not exactly what I wanted. You suck. I want my deposit back. And they don't even give you a chance to try to redraw it or make it the way they want. They just say, give me my money back. And that's completely unfair. Any client should expect that if you don't get it right the first time, that you'll adjust it and make it the way they want. And you should have that opportunity to be able to do that. Because drafts are an incremental part of the design process. They're completely necessary and they're to be expected. When the client sees something that they don't like, that helps you move in a direction towards something that they will like. And again, if you're just shooting in the dark trying to guess all these details for the client, you're performing a service. And you're performing that service out of necessity because the client wasn't clear enough about what they wanted. If that client had said, I want a dump truck drawn from an isometric view from the top, I want it to be green, I want it to be exactly this dump truck here, here's a few reference images, here's a rough sketch that I made to show you exactly what I want, then that would be absolutely clear and there'd be no guessing and there'd be no, you didn't get it right, you suck, give me my deposit back, because they get exactly what they asked for. You can't satisfy a client who doesn't know what they want. And those are the kind of people who are going to say, give me my money back. Now, in the same way that a client can not pay you for your time and then you're kind of screwed, and unless you take them to court, you're not going to get paid. Well, the same goes for them. If they gave you a deposit, that's your deposit. The deposit was so that you get paid for your time. And even if that's time that you use to help show them what they don't want, you still performed a service for them. So the deposit is yours to keep. Deposits are there to protect the artist. Now, you don't want to be rude, but you want to make sure that the client understands why you're keeping the deposit. And if you make that clear up front before you start the project, then there's not going to be any confusion later. Now, in a similar scenario, maybe the client has paid you a deposit, you sent them some work, but they're not happy with the work, so they don't want to pay you the second half of the payment. If it's because you made a mistake, then you're responsible for fixing that mistake for free. Otherwise, you just want to follow my previous advice. But if it involves additional work that you didn't agree to up front, make sure that you're getting compensated for that additional time to complete the project. If the client still refuses to pay and they don't want to give you the chance to fix the project or add to it to complete it, then there's really not much you can do about it. And again, you just don't want to be in this scenario. That's why, as I mentioned earlier, you don't want to send any final deliverables until after you've received the final payment. If you do it that way, then the client has to pay you to get the final files. Now, if you haven't sent the client the final files, but they still don't pay you the final half of the project and you never hear from them again, do something with those files, repurpose them, upload them as stock images, keep them in your portfolio and use them as examples on your website. They're your images, they're not the client's images, they didn't pay you in full for them, so you can do whatever you want with them. And because you own the rights to the images, the client can't use that image. And if you see that the client has your drafts up on their website or they've sent them off for someone else to finish, you can enforce your rights and say, look, I still own these images. Unless you pay me in full, you're not allowed to use these. And this is why watermarking is especially important. If there's a big watermark across your image, they're not going to be able to send that off to another designer and say, hey, can you complete this? Because that designer is going to go, whoa, how come you didn't pay this person to complete the project? And then, of course, they won't be able to use something with a watermark, so it basically makes that image useless. In our next scenario, this is a big project that involves multiple sections or multiple pieces of content. And let's say you need to create 10 different book covers for this project, and you're going through and you're going to do one at a time. You'll complete the first one, they'll pay you for the first one. Then you'll move on to the second one, and they'll pay you for that one. And of course, you're getting a deposit for each of these. Let's say after you completed book cover 2, the client goes, you know what? Actually, I'm going to scale this project down a bit, and I'm just going to stick to 2 book covers. But guess what? You already started working on book cover 3 because they asked you to do some preliminary sketches and research. And so you've put in a few hours for book cover 3, but they're deciding, you know what? I'm going to kind of hold off on this for now and just stick with the 2 covers. Well, you want to make sure that since you put in that extra time, they pay you for that additional part. They pay you up until the point to where you're fairly compensated for the time that you put in. If the reason why they're cutting the project short is because they can't afford to pay you and maybe they want to hire someone cheaper or do it themselves, just make sure that they understand that if anybody else is going to work on that project, you need to make sure that your rights to those images that you created are maintained. And so you should get credit, and just make sure that you're aware of what's being done with the work that you created. Okay, so here's a quick and easy one. In this scenario, the client is rude and unpleasant, but you've already done work without any compensation. Don't get in this situation. Always get a deposit. Okay, well, how about the client is rude and hard to work with, but they already gave you a deposit and you already did some of the work? It's not unreasonable to call out the client, explain to them how they're being rude, and give them an opportunity to apologize. If they continue to be rude, either refund their deposit, less your time spent on the project, of course, or just give them a refund in full if you want them to buzz off for good. And honestly, sometimes that's the less stressful option if there's not a whole lot of money involved. Okay, so here's another scenario that might sound really awesome at first, and that is being overbooked with too many clients. Now, you might think that's a good thing because you're going to make a ton of money, but guess what? You're going to be completely overwhelmed by all of these projects, and everyone's going to want to be priority. Everyone's going to want you to work on their project before this other person's project. And while you can try to stack things and prioritize things and juggle things, it always ends up biting you in the butt, and you have like 4 or 5 different people breathing down your neck to get their project done. So here's the problem. You are in demand and you need to compensate for that. How do you compensate for that? You raise your rates. And what that's going to do is that's going to kind of filter things a little bit. You're going to be doing less work and you're going to be making more money. You're going to be filtering out anybody who wants to be a cheapskate, anybody who doesn't value your time, anybody who thinks that they can find some work for cheaper. That's fine. Yes, you're going to lose business, but you're only going to lose a small amount of money. Whereas the amount of money that you're going to gain by charging more is going to compensate for that. And in fact, it might end up giving you a surplus of money. You might make more money because you're charging more. I know that sounds crazy, but that's how it works. People value you more if you value yourself, as I said earlier. Now, of course, it's not hard to raise your rates for new clients because they don't know what your existing rates were, but pre-existing clients might take an issue with that because they're used to paying you whatever your rate was, and now it's going to be a little bit higher, so that affects them. So you want to raise your rates on existing clients incrementally, but don't double your rate on them. Because of the clients that you like, it's good to have some clients who you have a good rapport with, who are going to be long-term clients and provide the backbone of your business. But as long as you explain the rate increase to them and you say, look, my cost of living is going up, there's inflation, I'm more in demand, people want more of my time. As I'm getting more experience, the work I'm doing is better, I'm getting to know your business more, and so it's faster for me to complete a project. I deserve to get more money. And if they're decent people who value your time and want their time to be valued as well, they'll pay you for that. Now, I do want to clarify that you don't want to raise your rates mid-job. If you're in the middle of a project, you don't want to say, look, I told you it'd be 50 an hour, but now it's going to be 100 an hour, because that's just not cool. You definitely do not want to do that. With the exception of maybe the terms of the project change. Like, for example, if you're working on something for 3 years and you thought it was going to take 6 months, of course, in that span of 3 years, things are going to change in your life. And if you need to be compensated more or you need to raise your rate, that's not unreasonable. But if you're working on a project that's only taking a week to complete, you don't want to double your rate. That's just crazy. So I know that was a lot of advice. So I'm going to summarize a bit more, and I'm going to share some tips for what to watch out for as a freelance artist and designer. The client says, this shouldn't take long. It's an easy job. It should only take an hour or 2. This person does not respect your time. I'd consider passing on this job unless it's someone that's a regular client or it actually is a really easy job. Next is a client who wants you to make free samples for them before making a commitment to hire you, aka a deposit. You're not Costco. No one's getting any free samples here. It may work that way in the grocery industry, but in most professions, any time spent on a project is billable time, even if it's corresponding to emails or creating sketches or meeting with the client in person or on the phone. Any time that you spend on their project is time that you should be compensated for fairly. I would recommend staying away from these sorts of clients. It's not uncommon for a client to ask for a sample and then have another designer create the final version for cheaper. In other cases, they'll take your sample and they'll decide that they don't like it, and you'll never hear from them again. Don't give away anything for free. Always ask for a deposit before submitting any ideas or any sketches. If the client wants to meet with you in person or have a conference over the phone, ask them to commit to paying you during the meeting before you start the project. And if you do end up meeting in person, use that as an opportunity to collect the deposit once you agree on the project. Our next client is getting design feedback from multiple partners who do not agree on their expectations. This is going to cause excessive revisions. I guarantee it, because you've got this person wants it this color, this person wants it this color, and there's no captain there to say, look, I'll take your ideas and we'll combine them together and this is what we'll get. Because it's going to be a constant trying to appease everybody and make everybody happy. Just multiply one person's expectations by however many people make up that panel, and that's how much you're going to have to multiply the revisions for the project. So I would kind of avoid situations like that, or make it very clear that that group of people need to agree on what they want and be 100% crystal clear on that before they have you do any work on the project. And last is a client who wants to see multiple choices, but only wants to pay for the time spent designing one. This is called a design contest, folks. Don't agree to this. You deserve to be paid for all of the concepts you create, even if all but one of those concepts are rejected. You're helping the client decide what they want by showing them what they don't want. And in the last section of this video, I want to go through my workflow. What is my thought process as soon as I get a job request? And how do I manage it along the way? So let's say I just open an email and there's a job offer. First of all, if the job seems like a hassle or it doesn't sound interesting, I turn it down. Even if the client is offering fair compensation. If I just don't want to do it, I'm not going to do it. If the client offers a lowball rate, I don't even reply. You might be able to persuade some clients to come up with a more reasonable budget, but it's usually not worth your time because they'll look for a cheaper designer or do it themselves. So don't waste any time in correspondence. My initial email to follow up to the job request is of course free. I'll send maybe 2 or 3 short emails to help understand the project so we can agree on the terms. But if emails start to become excessive, I ask clients to commit to a deposit before any further emails. Because again, they're using your time, you're discussing things, you're consulting with them, and that's all billable time. So then after deciding whether or not I'm going to take on the project, next comes the estimate. First, I always try to get the client to divulge their budget. This gives me a good idea of whether or not they have realistic expectations, and it really helps to weed out cheapskates quickly. There's no sense wasting time on an estimate if the client only expects to pay $20 for a logo. They either won't reply to your estimate or they'll give you a counter offer that's much lower than your bid. You'll also want to ask about a deadline. If the deadline's not reasonable, you need to ask the client to extend it if possible. If the deadline is firm, charge a rush fee. This can be a multiplier on your hourly rate or a flat fee. So you could say, you know what, if you need me to do this the next day, I'm going to charge you 50% more. And it's not unfair to do that. Plenty of businesses do that all the time. If that doesn't sound fair to the client, just explain, look, there's other people who have already paid me a deposit who are expecting me to work on their project. They're ahead of you in line. And if you want me to put you in line ahead of them, you got to pay me extra. Now, not everyone will give you their budget. Some people don't know what it is. And some people need you to help explain to them what the project will cost because they don't know. They only want to pay as much as it costs. They don't want to pay any more than that. So when I give an estimate, I typically give a range of what I think it will cost and what it could cost with excessive revisions. I explain the range and I make sure that they understand clearly that more work is going to involve more compensation. I make sure to mention that this is not a binding estimate, and if the job needs to be extended, we need to agree on additional compensation. Occasionally, I will agree on a capped fee if the project is very, very clear, and in these cases, I'll usually slightly overbid in case I'm wrong about how much work is involved. And in that scenario, if I complete a project way under estimate, I only bill for the time I spent on the project and I don't overcharge. For the project estimate and for the final bill, I bill in 15-minute increments. This makes it a lot easier to keep track of your time, and it makes it a lot easier to bill the client. After the estimate, it's good to discuss the image rights. If the project calls for it, make sure to discuss who owns the rights to the images created for the project. In most cases, unless the client is providing the majority of the collateral and concepts, you as the artist own the copyright to the images created. For example, if you're creating a logo or a brochure for a client's business, you can assume the client will be entitled to the rights. If the client is describing every single detail about an image and you've had no creative input, just assume it's theirs. However, if you're creating the design elements, the artwork, and the graphics, those may be of value to you in other applications. For example, you created some icons for a client's website. Why not remove their branding and use them as stock art so that you can get more value out of that particular project? Technically, you'll need to grant a license to the client to use these images, but that's sort of implied. If necessary, make sure to specify who owns the rights to the images so there aren't any conflicts down the road. In the vast majority of cases, most clients don't care to own the image rights. If the client does want the image rights, they need to pay an additional fee on top of the payment for the work done. Consider that this image, once sold to the client, could be resold to another party. So you want to make sure that you factor that into your fee, and keep in mind that once you sell that image, you can no longer use that work for your own personal or commercial purposes unless the client gives you permission. Next is the most important part of the email, and that is discussing the deposit. I explain why I ask for a deposit, and then I explain that the deposit is typically half of my project estimate. And when I'm asking for a deposit, I want to make sure that the amount is going to cover the initial work that I put in. Now, if I get this far and the client decides that they're not going to agree to those terms, then I don't take the project. I don't even bother writing them back. End of story. I'm of the philosophy that you should nurture clients who treat you well, and you should stay as far away as possible from clients who do not value your time. And even if it's clients who you've worked with for a while, who you have a relationship with, if the relationship just isn't working for you, stop working for them. Sure, you'll lose one client, but someone else will come along who will respect your time to fill that gap. So only do work for clients who you enjoy working with. And then last, you'll want to let the client know that you'll need to receive the final payment before sending the final deliverables or final files for the project. Okay, so now we've agreed to terms for the project. They've given me a deposit. Now it's time to create some drafts. Most clients who end up paying a deposit are going to end up paying the full bill, but some may not. So I always make sure to send small previews of the project rather than the full version. I will occasionally add a watermark if it's a new client who I'm uncertain about. And I never send the client the working files or a high-res preview unless they've paid me in full. I make sure to save copies of all of my drafts, because in case something happens to a final version or the client wants you to go back to an older version, there's no sense in having to redesign something that you already made. And back up your work regularly. If you lose work in progress, you'll have to eat the cost of replacing the work. Okay, so we've sent the client some drafts. They're happy with the drafts. Now we've done some more work and completed the project. Now it's time to get that final payment. So once the client has approved the final version, send them an invoice for the final payment, and let them know that you'll send them the deliverables once the payment has been processed. Once your payment has been received, send the agreed upon deliverables. If the client does not request the working files, such as the PSD or the Adobe Illustrator file, then keep them. It'll mean that they'll be more likely to come back to you for future work rather than doing it themselves or finding someone else who's less expensive. You'll want to make sure you remove any of your watermarks from the final deliverables. Now, in some cases, you'll send the client the deliverables, but then a few months later, or a few years later, they'll email you and they'll ask for them again because they were lost or misplaced. In that case, you might want to consider billing them for the time spent resending the files if it's a significant amount of time. If the client asks for any additional work or additional versions of the deliverables, let's say you sent them a black and white logo and a red logo, but now all of a sudden they want a green and a blue and a yellow one, that's extra work that you're going to have to put in. So you need to make sure that it's clear that they're going to have to pay you for that extra time, unless it's something super easy and you don't mind doing it for free. And finally, if there's a client who you've done a lot of work for and you have a lot of their files, tons and tons and tons of files in a bunch of different folders, you have to keep track of all that stuff, you should let them know that you're not responsible for storing those files long term, unless you want to. If the client's a regular, just ask them to provide you with an external hard drive and then put all of their files on it. It wouldn't hurt to maybe have a backup of that also. So ask the client to create their own backups as well. So that's all of the advice that I have about getting paid for the work that you do. I know at this point your head is probably spinning, but this advice is like gold because it's going to spare you from not getting paid for your time. If you found this information helpful, take a quick second to like this video. And if you're new to my channel, I'd love to have you subscribe. I have a lot more digital art videos like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Always get a deposit.